Okay, so we can start. Good evening, everybody. Welcome for those for whom it's the first time. So I hope you're all going well. So yesterday we saw the classification of synapsids and why people think and why paleontologists think that mammals are descended from synapsids. We saw also the origin of mammalness and how mammalness evolved in the ancestors of mammals. And today we are going to have a look at the origin and evolution of the mammalian brain. And particularly we'll look at the origin of the nervous system in mammals and the specializations of the nervous system in mammals through the evolution of the 5 senses in synapsids. So first, a little recap of what we saw yesterday, but the very, very basic. So the sprawling pelycosaurs, then you have the semi-erect therapsids, and then the cynodonts, completely erect posture, which forms the non-mammalian synapsids. And here you have the mammals that are defined by their type of lower jaw articulation. Just a reminder, so that we can continue on a strong basis. So now, you may wonder, how do people look at the evolution of the nervous system in extinct species? The nervous system is made of soft tissue, and soft tissue do not fossilize. So how do you look at fossilized how do you find a fossilized brain or a fossil inner ear? So first, you can get lucky, like the tongue child. So the tongue child is the skull of an Australopithecus, and this skull has molded the shape of the brain case the sediment inside the skull has molded the shape of the brain case. And so we have a picture of the brain case, which is itself quite similar to the morphology of the brain itself. And on the tongue child, what is particularly interesting is that you can see some soft tissue imprints, like the veins, like the folds of the brain. So it's quite a nice picture of what the brain was, at least from the external aspect. You won't find neurons, you won't find what's inside the brain, like the glands and things like this, but the outside aspect of the brain is accessible, is made accessible by this natural mold. And sometimes you can have a mold of the inner ear, which is called the bony labyrinth. So labyrinth because it's a very complex structure, and it's bony because it's the capsule, actually. It's a mold of the capsule of the inner ear. So here you have the cochlea of a primitive elephant, an ancestral elephant that lived about 40 million years ago in Africa. So this little inner ear is about 40 million years ago, and you can see that it's very well preserved because the bony capsule was preserved. And sediments made a natural mold of this bony capsule. So the first way to study this soft tissue structure is to be very lucky. The other is the barbarian version of the story. You create your own luck and you destroy your fossils looking for this structure. So basically, imagine you find a tongue child, but complete, and you just intentionally break it to find what you're looking for. And when you're a scientist, you want to do it properly. So what people did, and what particularly Brink, who's a famous paleontologist, famous South African paleontologist, did, is he used this machine to grind fossils down. So basically, what he was doing with this machine, he was putting his fossils like this, grinding a slice, make a drawing, grind another slice, half a millimeter thick, make another drawing, another half a millimeter, until everything is ground down. So it's irreversibly destructive, but you learn a lot about your fossils. But today we don't do this anymore, because today we have access, like easy access to X-rays. X-rays were used in paleontology long before today, I mean even long before I was born. But they were not easily accessible. Now they are much more easily accessible. The technique is cheaper. Also, you can more easily travel to have access to this kind of facility, which is the synchrotron in France, in Grenoble. So very often South African scientists can fly to the synchrotron with their fossils and scan them. And thanks to these X-rays, this is a particle accelerator which generates very powerful beam of X-rays, because you need a lot of energy to go through a fossil. So thanks to this synchrotron, you can create the powerful X-rays that enables you to look through your fossils. And thanks to that, we can create very nice picture, beautiful imagery, inspiring imagery. So you can see here this skull with the brain. In red was the inner ear. This is the maxillary canal for the trigeminal nerve. So basically, you can reconstruct the internal anatomy of any fossil without destroying it. That's what is very interesting. You don't destroy your fossil. So it's a completely non-destructive technique. And even very big fossils, so this one was a skull about this large. And even big fossils, you can have a pretty nice picture of the brain. So here is the parietal foramen for the third eye, and here are blood vessels. So you can see that you can have access to a very large amount of information using these X-rays. So now let's go through the 5 senses of synapsids and how they tell us the evolution from reptiles to mammals. So first, what could they hear? Let's have a look at the inner ear. So this is the basic inner ear of a mammal-like reptile, basic inner ear of a synapsid. So here you have what will become one day the cochlea, the curled part of the inner ear, the auditory part of the inner ear, and here are the semicircular canals, which is the organ of balance. So you have 1, 2, and 3 canals that records the movement of the head, in the 3 dimensions of space. So that's what you look at when you want to reconstruct hearing capabilities of the species. And looking at this inner ear, it was possible on a variety of synapsid skulls. At the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, we have scanned some 80 specimens, which is already quite a lot to study. And looking at these specimens, we found that actually we can estimate that they could hear frequencies that were around 4 kilohertz. So 4 kilohertz, it's quite low. It's actually kind of a reptilian. It's what modern reptiles can usually hear. Mammals can hear above 20 kilohertz. 20 kilohertz is like the limit of it's the lower limit of frequencies that only mammal can hear. So below that, that's the reptilian playground, and above that, the higher frequency than 20 kilohertz, that's the mammalian playground, to simplify. So these synapsids, they were quite reptilian in their way of hearing. They were low-frequency specialists. And high-frequency hearing only evolved in later mammals. during the Mesozoic, so during dinosaur time. So why is that? Why is it that mammals only evolved high-frequency hearing? So remember yesterday I told you that mammals evolved smaller, their size shrinked at dinosaur time, and they adapt to nocturnality. So you can see here this shift in body size through time. So this is Mesozoic, so this is the dinosaur time. This is the Permian, when the mammal-like reptiles were very abundant, and you can see the shrink in body mass happening here. So they became smaller, and when you're small, you have certain constraints on your hearing capabilities. First, the space between your two ears is very small. So this is the skull of a rat. So a rat is basically this size. And the space between the two ears is very small, which is a problem when you want to listen for low frequencies, because low frequencies have a very small, they have a very long, what do you call it? Wavelength, thank you. Sorry. They have a very long wavelength, and so it's very difficult when you have only this space between your inner ears. It's very difficult to locate the wavelength, to locate the sound. So low frequencies are very difficult to locate for a mouse. It's already very difficult for us, like when you're in your house and one of your neighbors is listening to very loud bass music. You never know where it comes from. You never know if it's this neighbor, this one. Is it true or is it not? Yeah, it's very difficult to locate low frequencies, and it's even more difficult for a mouse because of this small space between the two inner ears. So that's a first problem of being small. And the second problem of being small is that you squeak. You have little, small vocal cords, and you cannot do like this. You squeak. And these squeak are very high frequencies. And so when you want to communicate with your companions, with the other member of the same species, you only communicate through squeaks. And there's no point of having an inner ear specialized into low frequency hearing if you can only communicate with high frequencies. So that's why early mammals were adapted to high frequency hearing, became adapted to high frequency hearing, because their size shrinked. And so how do you adapt to low frequency hearing? So this is the why. Now how do you adapt to low frequency hearing? First, it's the evolution of the ossicles. So remember, yesterday I showed you the transition from a jaw articulation between the quadrate and the articular to a jaw articulation between the squamosal and the dentary. Do you remember that? Of course you do. Yeah. It was so clear and it was so smooth. So yeah, there is this transition, and this transition enabled the ossicles to move into the middle ear, and so this quadrate articulation became the hammer. The articular became the hammer. The quadrate became the anvil, and the stapes became the stirrup. And with these ossicles, you can transform the low impedance matching tympanic membrane, the signal that comes from the low impedance matching tympanic membrane, into a signal, a high impedance matching signal. So basically you improve, that's your airborne hearing. So the sounds that come from the air are better recorded with this system of 3 ossicles because it creates a lever that transforms the low impedance matching signal at the level of the tympanic membrane into a high impedance matching signal. And also the inertia of these ossicles improve directional hearing. So remember, you cannot locate the low frequencies because the wavelength is very long. With this system of lever, you also create a kind of inertia that increases the delay between what you hear on the left side and what you hear on the right side. So basically it's easier, it amplifies the delay between left and right, and so you can more easily locate where does the sound comes from. Yeah.
So what would the impetus have, what would have created this extraordinary shift in mechanisms?
What would have created, sorry?
To shift from that early version of hearing to this. I mean, natural selection could never have done that. So what created that leap?
One must not underestimate what natural selection can do. But we will see right after. That's the next step. So, yeah, so first, yeah, that's quite your question, I think. What's the advantage that could have, the selective advantage that could have drive this evolution? So the question is, what do you do where you have the intermediate state? That's your question, am I right? So what's the advantage of the intermediate state? So the first advantage is that chewing is very noisy. And remember, the mammal-like reptiles is a special kind of reptiles because they can chew. So remember, they evolved molars with a canine before, and even before they are incisors, but they evolved molars so they can chew. They evolved cheeks, so the food is not falling on each side of the mouth when they are chewing. They evolved the secondary hard palate that enables to breathe in the same time as they can chew. And that's something we can do. We can chew and breathe in the same times. A crocodile could not do that. So chewing is a special adaptation of synapsids, and particularly in cynodonts. And chewing is very noisy, so it creates a lot of parasites in your hearing, a lot of back noise that prevents you from hearing anything else like a predator coming. So this evolution of the articulation and the movement, the fact that the articulation moved into the middle ear removes the ossicles from the lower jaw and thus kind of reduce that noise. But it was certainly very constrained. It was certainly very constrained because mammal-like reptiles were in a comfortable position, which is the position still held by the modern reptiles, in which they could hear the sound that came from the ground. So when you see a crocodile, for example, crocodiles often have their head on the ground, they are listening. They are listening what's happening because they can hear low frequencies and particularly seismic waves. And mammal-like reptiles, synapsids were like that in the beginning, but because these ossicles were pushed back into the middle ear, they adapt more and more to airborne sounds. And so this situation was probably quite uncomfortable. And it was driven mostly by the necessity, again, of chewing, because here when you chew, you apply a lot of constraint of like torsion and strength, like the muscle, the temporal muscle applies a lot of strength and constraints on your mandible. And these early mammal-like reptiles, when they were trying to chew, they would have a lot of little bones inside their mandible. And this is like a jigsaw puzzle that prevents, it's a very fragile structure. And so the more they evolved and the more the masticatory muscle became attached to only one bone, which is called the dentary. And you see that the dentary became dominant over any other bones. And this strengthened the lower jaw and pushed back all these little bones. And these little bones, as you can see here in this juvenile possum, they are there, and when the possum becomes an adult, like us, these bones become the ossicles. So you have, that's the evolution. That's not easy. That's definitely not easy to understand. Yes.
Would it not also? They went from being splay-footed to being upright.
Yeah.
And in becoming upright, their jaw would no longer be on the ground, so they wouldn't be able to pick up that ground signal anyway. They would become more and more reliant on airborne sound.
That's also true, yes, indeed. That's also true. But they also became smaller, so their head became closer to the ground, so they could have easily compensated. So, but that's one of the mechanisms, one of the possible mechanisms. But it's usually not the first to be invoked because of the shrinking in size, and so basically they were closer to the ground than before. So you can easily disprove that hypothesis. But that's something that has been sometimes hypothesized. Indeed.
Predators then would be dinosaurs. That's what they were trying to avoid.
Yes. We'll talk about that again after. So basically, mammal-like reptiles evolved chewing. They evolve large masticatory muscles, and these masticatory muscles need a strong anchorage on the lower jaw, and this strong anchorage is not provided by a jaw with multiple bones. It's provided by a jaw with one single dominant bone, which is the dentary. And so natural selection has favored those animals with the strongest anchorage, which incidentally pushed back all this post-dentary bone, this non-dentary bone, into the back of the jaw. And these bones, like the juvenile possum shows us, became the ossicles. This is the smoother version of the explanation. Is it clear for everybody, or should I go over it, go through it over again? So, and because of that, you can say that it's high frequency hearing, the necessity to listen to hear for high frequencies and to accommodate the masticatory muscles, both in terms of space, because it became bigger and bigger, and because in terms of strength, because it became even more powerful and thus created a lot of constraint, a lot of stress on the lower jaw, that created the middle ear ossicles of mammals. So actually, hearing airborne sound is just a side effect. So this shift from the ground to airborne sound is more like a side effect of this transformation, which is due to the development of the muscles, than a primary effect. So that's the answer to your question. So hearing the fact that you hear better airborne song with ossicles, yeah, it's not the primary selective force. The primary selective force was on the muscle and on the lower jaw to become stronger and to increase the surface of insertion of the masticatory muscle. So, what does the inner ear say about that? So, when you look at the inner ear in therapsids, pronunciation. So, when you look at the inner ear of therapsids and in cynodont, you can see that it's basically reptilian. So you have the semicircular canal and this little thing that is not that will become eventually the cochlea, but is not yet a cochlea. And you can see that it's very simple. It remains simple all up to early mammals. And then in these early mammals, so that graph continues here, that little pointy proto-cochlea or pseudo-cochlea starts bending and bending and bending until it completely coils in modern mammals, so placental and marsupials. In an interesting way, the ornithorhynchus, which is the platypus, so monotremes, they still have this non-coiled cochlea, L-shaped cochlea. And this also, the lengthening of the cochlea is also, and the coiling is also interpreted as an adaptation to high-frequency hearing. Why? Because low-frequency hearing is located at the basis of the cochlea. So here you have the base of the cochlea. It's the low-frequency hearing part of the cochlea. And then the high-frequency hearing part lengthened and coiled, which increased the capacity to record high frequencies. So there is also the cochlea, the evolution of the cochlea also tell us the same story of adaptation to high frequency hearing. And just a fun fact, when you look at the development of a mouse embryo, the story repeats itself. You have the pointy thing that bends, and coils and form a cochlea. So you've sometimes heard that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Maybe you've heard that. So the development recapitulates evolution, which is an oversimplification of the concept, but the idea is there. Yes? Yes, it's the same. I mean, the shape in the end is different, but the process, it looks exactly the same. Yeah, I show you the mouse because it's a model animal, but yeah, in human it's similar. It's actually funny because these two canals, the two horizontal canals, they also develop first compared to the two vertical, sorry. Vertical canals here, semicircular canals, they develop first and then the horizontal canal developed much later. So it becomes distinct, you see, well after the others. And that's also something that you see in the fossil record, but in fish. So that's also an interesting thing. But this, it's not because the inner ear of modern mammals it's very derived, it's very evolved toward high frequency hearing. It's not because this happened on the one side that the therapsids did not specialize into other ways. It doesn't mean that low frequency hearing is primitive. And for example, here you have a family of therapsids called the chistecephalids. So It's a family of therapsids that developed a beak. It's called, Kistecephalid dicynodons. So the dicynodons developed the beak, and the kistecephalid, among the dicynodons, they developed adaptation to burrowing and fossoriality. And they became, we think, as much adapted as living underground as mole rats. Do you know mole rats? Or am I pronouncing it well? Mole rat. Okay, yeah. So yeah, they became really strongly adapted to life underground. And this is reflected also on their inner ear. So here you have the modern animals, snakes, a land-dwelling animals and an underground-dwelling animals, snake. And here you can see in this therapsid that the inner ear is very similar, like inflated, completely ballooned, just like that of an underground snake. And this, the evolution from a regular type of inner ear to the balloon type of inner ear is very well documented by the fossil record. And it parallels adaptation, particularly the humerus. You can see the insertion of the muscle of the humerus, which is the bone of the arm. You can see the muscle insertion for the big digging movements that became bigger and bigger as they are adapting also to low frequency hearing. Why? Because underground you hear only seismic waves. So very, very low frequency hearing. So low frequency hearing is just a different type of adaptation. That doesn't mean that everything about hearing in therapsid is primitive. But the inner ear is also the organ of balance. And to talk to you about balance in therapsids, I want to introduce you to moscops or moschops. Choose your pronunciation. I'm not sure which one is the right. If it was in France, we would say moscops. So moscops was a very big animal, like a rhino, a 270 million years old rhino, with a big head, and they were like we hypothesized that they were very likely fighting each other with their head, like head first. And this reflects on their inner ear. So here I told you have the semicircular canals, but the two vertical one and the horizontal one. And what's interesting about the horizontal canal is that it really earns its name. It's always horizontal. However it's put inside the head, the natural posture of the head will always be with this canal horizontal. And so when you see a museum specimen like this one, you feel that this is a natural position for the head. But no, because the semicircular canal is not horizontal. So you put back the canal horizontal, and that gives this position. And how this position can be natural for them? Because of the fight. So their skull is so strongly adapted to fighting that actually the inner ear underwent a complete reorientation. Oh, no, sorry, the inner ear remained at the same place. It's the skull that completely reorientate around the inner ear. And in this way, when they are fighting, so imagine this is another head butting on this one. The shock goes there, is transmitted through this very thick bar of bone, and it goes straight to dissipate in the neck. So this posture of the head is an adaptation to headbutting because it helps the dissipation of the energy in the neck. And this adaptation was so strong that the skull completely rotated around the inner ear. So the inner ear remains horizontal, but everything else is deflected. So that's one funny implication of inner ear morphology. Let's go to another sense now, because I've been talking too much about the evolution of hearing. So the touch, and particularly we'll look at the whiskers. So the first thing you have to know about whiskers is what are whiskers for. So whiskers, they are tactile organs. They are the animals use them to feel their environment, particularly in the dark. They use them to touch. So basically they move, you can see, they move their whiskers like this, and they can feel what's happening around them. It's also sensitive to the vibrations of the hair, not the hair, the air, no H. So it's very sensitive to the vibrations of the air, and so they don't really have to touch everything to feel their presence. They just have to feel the slight movement in the air. That's enough. So it's a very, very sensitive organ, these whiskers, and yeah, they are useful because they can move. So they can orientate the whiskers in the direction in which, like an antenna, they orientate the whiskers in the direction they want to feel the things. And in therapsids, like in this little guy, if you look very carefully, very closely, so there's no chance you can see them from where you are, but if you look in this area of the skull, you will find little holes, little pits. And these little pits, people have hypothesized since the 1930s that they were the rooting points of whiskers. So here, it's not from the 1930s, it's from 2014. And in this 2014 picture, you can see that the author imagined that the whiskers were rooted in all those pits that you can see on the snout. And this is from 2014 also, a documentary featuring Roger Smith from the Easyco Museum. And in this documentary, Roger Smith shows us these little pits, and also imagine that whiskers were going out of these pits. Problem. Do you think Tyrannosaurus Rex, the giant dinosaur from Jurassic Park, had whiskers? If you follow that hypothesis, you will have to imagine that Tyrannosaurus Rex, the tyrannosaurs, had whiskers, because they do have these pits. So what we did with my colleagues at WITS, we CT scanned, we use X-ray on our therapsids in order to understand what's happening there. What are those holes for? What are those little pits for if they are not for whiskers? Or if we have to admit that they were for whiskers, then we will have to understand how Tyrannosaurus is different from therapsids. So we look at these little pits, and we find by scanning them that they are all connected to a canal that runs inside the snout, and this canal was for a nerve called the trigeminal nerve, which is the same nerve that innervates the whiskers. So as far as we go now, there is a good chance that these pits were rooting points for whiskers. But the problem, I told you, is that whiskers needs to move. Whiskers are for whisking. Nothing to do with whiskey. So they are for whisking, and enclosed in that canal, the nerve cannot follow the movement of the whiskers. And actually, there is also no space for the muscles to move the whiskers in this configuration. So it's very unlikely that whiskers were present, because whisking was impossible. To make whisking possible, you need these little foramen, these little holes, which are called the infraorbital foramen. So it's called infraorbital because it's below the orbit, and the foramen is basically a hole. So there's one single hole, and through this hole, the trigeminal nerve goes out, and then it ramifies into the flesh, ear, into the lips, and into the cheek. And in this way, if I had whiskers, I could move them, more or less. I'm not a hipster, so I don't have whiskers. But yeah. So basically, if this thing had whiskers, then the canal should stop there, not here. All these ramifications must not be in the bone. So then, looking at the evolution of this canal, we see that it only transforms into a small foramen, and these ramifications do not no longer happen inside the bone, but happen outside the bone, only in a group called the Probending. So here you have early Probending, and here you have derived Probending with a name that is very difficult to pronounce, but these animals were the whiskered one, and these belong to the Cynodontia, so again the closest relative of mammals. So if whiskers evolved in therapsids if whiskers evolved among cynodonts, they evolved only in this group, the Probending. And remember, yesterday we talked a lot about the Probending because they are the ones who evolved the MSX2 gene, which is the gene that enabled the presence of hairs. So again, we have kind of a consistent picture for the evolution of hair around here and the evolution of whiskers a bit later, after the 246 million years boundary. But hair could be present and whiskers could have evolved after the hairs evolved because of MSX2. So, yeah, the big thing about that is if you have the little pits in the snout, you're like a reptile. You're like a dinosaur. But if you have a foramen, an infraorbital foramen, one single hole, and then the nerve ramifying in the flesh, not in the bone, then you are more likely to have whiskers. So that's why we think that these little guys only had whiskers, which is convenient because they are the closest relatives of mammals. But again, it's not because you don't have whiskers that you are necessarily primitive. And in particular, when you look again at the dicynodont evolved a completely different way. The opposite way, actually, to whiskers. Instead of developing nice moving lips with whiskers, they developed a completely keratinous beak. You can see the turtle-like beak with the big difference that in the middle of the beak they had two big canines. So these two big canines make them therapsids, there's no doubt about that, but they developed their own way to do things with their beak. And again, you can look, using X-rays, you can look at the evolution of innervation of the face, and without going into too much detail, you can see the transition from an animal with a dominant ear maxillary nerve. Yeah, this green area here is the maxillary nerve, and the maxillary nerve becomes smaller when the beak appears, and the beak itself is innervated by this blue branch here. So this blue branch corresponds to another nerve, which is the nasopalatine nerve, and the same nerve innervates the beak in turtles. So the nerve is not, the beak is not like a dead structure, it's a living structure, and it has feelings. And these feelings are not from this green nerve as in the primitive condition, but it's from the blue nerve, basically. And so they evolve in completely parallel fashion with the turtles. They are not related to turtles at all, they are related to mammals, but they evolve their own way. So same idea as for hearing, it's not because you're not like a mammal that you are primitive. You can evolve your complete different stuff. The smell, taste and smell. I put taste and smell in the same package because it's basically the same sense, the same receptors. So mammals do have a great sense of smell, except primates, so except us. But most mammals have a great sense of smell because they have large olfactory bulbs. So this is a very idealized picture of a brain, view from the top. Here you have the cerebrum, here the cerebellum, and here you have the olfactory bulbs in red, the olfactory bulbs which are responsible for olfaction. So this is quite easy. And these large olfactory bulbs constitute a character that is shared only by mammals. So I've tried to put all mammals in this blue square here and all synapsids, non-mammalian synapsids, in this red square. So you can see the large olfactory bulbs evolved here in the green one and in all these blue ones that are all contained in this blue box. So the large olfactory bulb is definitely a mammalian character, and a little later it's accompanied by the ossification of the ethmoid support for the olfactory epithelium. So the surface of olfactory epithelium increases and is supported by these nasal scrolls that you can see here in the nose of a aardvark. I'm trying very hard. Vark. Aardvark. So smell, like a good sense of smell, at first sight, seems to be a mammalian stuff. It's not a synapsid stuff at all. But there is one synapsid, which is a cynodont, like one of the most mammal-like cynodont you can find, but it's still considered not a mammal. Its name is Brasilitherium because it comes from Brazil, and you can see that compared to his cousins, he has super large olfactory bulbs. So the sense of smell, the mammalian sense of smell, also evolved in cynodonts. It was already there in one of the most derived, one of the most mammal-like cynodonts that you can find. The brain itself. So the brain itself, you can see from this very basal therapsid through cynodonts through these two mammals. Here you have the early mammal Megazostrodon, which was found near Lesotho, and here you have the platypus, the one from Australia. You can see that the brain actually increased in size. So you can see also the olfactory bulbs that are proportionally very big compared to those little two bulgings there. So it's a top view. It's skull's view from the top. So here what increases in size between in size between the cynodont and the mammal is the cerebrum. So people think, but it's not sure because we only have the cast of the brain, but people think it's the cortex that developed at this level. Maybe, by the way, in relation with the developments of hair, because hair are sensitive, and if you have hair all over your body, you have a lot of input coming to the brain, and to manage this input you need a very large cortex, particularly the somatosensory cortex, so the one on which you find the projection of the body. Have you seen already that projection of a body over the cortical surface, the surface of the brain? It's called the homunculus. Yes?
Does that mean that people with more hair have got a bigger brain?
Do you consider yourself hairy? It will influence my answer. Yeah, I mean, at the scale of million years, yeah, that's the idea. But funnily enough, humans have big brain and they have less hair, so it's not everything. So yeah, let's have a look. These are only 4 animals projected on the screen. Let's have a look to statistics. Woo. So here we have the size of the brain. Here you have the body size, so the weight. And you have a basic separation between placental mammals, so you, me, elephants, mice, we are all here, and reptiles and amphibians. No birds here, only reptiles and amphibians. So interestingly, you have quite a clear-cut separation between the placental mammals and the reptiles, except for some of the smallest body size. There is a little overlap. No surprise. Here you would find, for example, golden moles, you know, from the Kalahari Desert, tanrex, those little hedgehog from Madagascar. They are located here. Very small animals with tiny, tiny brain. And then we look at marsupials, monotremes, and you realize that marsupials and monotremes are covering a smaller surface than placental, and they have, in general, a smaller body mass and a smaller brain than placentals. And then you look at the mammals from the age of dinosaurs, so they don't go, they don't fall outside of the range of placental mammals. So there is like a kind of a typical mammalian, brain size, no, not brain size, but range of variation of brain size. But what you see is that the more you go away from placental mammals, and the more you tend toward that overlap, so that reptilian condition. And then, when you look at the synapsids, it's a completely different picture. Synapsids fall in part in the reptilian range of variation or in between placental mammals and amphibians. So to find them in between placental mammals and amphibians is quite expected, given that they are reptilian looking animals, but related to mammals. So that's what you would expect from this kind of animal, an intermediate position. But what is even more interesting is for the smaller synapsids, which are the cynodonts, the small cynodonts that gave birth to mammal. You see they are right in this little overlapping, this little overlap between the reptiles and the mammals. So you have an evolutionary trajectory in this graph. Brain evolution went from reptile-ish, and with the reduction in size, they move to this overlap, this region, which will eventually become an overlap between the reptilian and the mammalian brain. So you can reconstruct kind of evolution of the brain, which goes through a reptilian brain to a reptilian brain in a small body to a more and more and more mammalian brain. In terms of size, again. In terms of morphology, it's a lot more difficult to say because it's only a cast of the external morphology, so not easy. But in terms of size, that's what we have. And also what biologists found is that brain size is directly correlated to body temperature. So the bigger is your brain, the hotter is your body. So when you have a big brain, you're hot. And you're hairy. So, and here you have a selection of therapsid brain from the most from the closer, here you have the mammals, here you have the close relatives of mammals, and the more you go on the left, the less related to mammals you are. So these are the mammals, and they have a very high temperature, just below 40 degrees, like regular mammals do. And then you can see that this curve drops when you go to the non-mammalian side of the curve. But interestingly, you have little hot spots. So it's not unlikely that sometimes cynodonts and other therapsids just try endothermy, try a hot body temperature, a high body temperature, and yeah, just failed. Failed, or at least did not give descendant. But here, yeah, that's interesting that you can also reconstruct the evolution of body temperature. But again, therapsids are not primitive because they are not like mammals, and actually some therapsids were as derived as mammals in terms of body temperature if you follow that graph. And we'll finish by what could they see. And what's interesting about what they could see is that you can directly follow the evolution of the eye in therapsids and in synapsids and in early mammals because of the presence of a sclerotic ring. So this sclerotic ring is constituted of many plates of bones that encapsulates the eye. So it reflects directly the morphology of the eye. When you find a sclerotic ring, you know basically what was the eye looking like. You still find some sclerotic rings in reptiles, and particularly also in birds, birds of prey. Like if you, next time you go in a museum, you look at the skeletons of birds of prey, most of the time the sclerotic rings are there and they are very prominent. Particularly owls, because they are nocturnal, so they have very big eyes. So very big sclerotic rings. We don't know exactly what they were for, this sclerotic ring, but at least they give a good picture of what the eye was looking like, despite the fact that the eye is a soft tissue structure. And what we know from the sclerotic ring was determined by these two researchers, and they show that based on the size of the sclerotic ring, they determined that some species were nocturnal, some species were living, they were hunting or living more in the dawn or the dusk, or where the sun was low. And some species were strongly diurnal, so living in the bright day. So there was a variety of mode of life, of niche, ecological niches exploited by the therapsids. There was not one type of. They were there all day long and all night long also. Wait.